Ibrahim Traoré shocks the world, 5 million vines in the desert and steppe. In the heart of the Sahel, where each year the desert's winds bury more fields and drive families from their land, a voice rose with a declaration that sounded almost impossible. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and called upon them to plant 5 million grapevines along the shifting frontier where the Sahara devoured the soil. Grapes, symbols of Mediterranean valleys and European wine estates, were now to be rooted in one of the driest corners of the world. To many it sounded like madness, but to Traoré it was vision. A bold act meant not only to hold back the sands, but to rewrite the story of Burkina Faso. For generations, outside agencies and aid projects had promised salvation, yet the land kept vanishing and the people kept migrating. This time the call was different. It was not charity, not dependency, but a challenge to plant dignity itself in the soil. A gamble that survival could be transformed into pride, and that pride could fuel a Burkina Faso economic revival. Stay with us. This is more than a story of vineyards. It is the rebirth of a nation at the desert's edge. Subscribe and journey with us for a Burkina Faso that rises again. The desert does not march with soldiers, but with silence. Year by year, its sands advance. Fields that once grew millet or sorghum are swallowed, villages half buried, and cattle wander further only to die on barren ground. For generations, Burkina Faso's farmers had waged this unequal war, while international organizations flew in with irrigation schemes and imported seed projects that did little more than delay the inevitable. By the second decade of the 21st century, the nation was losing thousands of hectares of arable land each year. Families fled the countryside, swelling the outskirts of Ouagadougou with jobless youth. The desert was not only an ecological crisis, it was a humiliation, grain by grain erasing a people's dignity. Into this bleak landscape came a declaration unlike any before. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier who had seized power not long before, stood before his cabinet and declared, "If we cannot hold the desert, we cannot hold our nation." His solution was audacious: the planting of 5 million grapevines along the fragile belt where Sahel grasslands met Sahara sands. Grapes, symbols of wealth of European estates and Mediterranean festivals, were to be planted in one of the harshest landscapes on earth. His ministers, accustomed to plans for drought-resistant millet or donor-funded wells, were stunned into silence. Grapes, here, where even sorghum sometimes failed. But Traoré understood something deeper. To survive was not enough. His people needed a vision that would stir their pride, not simply their stomachs. Grapes carried more than calories. They carried symbolism. In scripture, they were blessings. In history, they marked civilization. By choosing grapes, he was telling his nation, we are not condemned to beg for grain. We can cultivate prosperity. The announcement swept across Burkina Faso. Farmers whispered in markets. Women's cooperatives debated the possibility of jam or raisins. Young men, skeptical yet curious, signed up for brigades tasked with digging trenches and preparing the soil. The army itself laid down rifles to take up shovels. Trellises were fashioned from rough wood, clay pots buried to hold scarce water, and irrigation lines stretched across sand like veins of hope. From Ouagadougou to the furthest Sahel frontier, families carried seedlings on their backs, planting them into trenches as though they were planting the nation's future. The strategy had 3 layers. First, ecological. Vines, with roots that dig deep, could stabilize soil and slow evaporation. A living wall against desertification. Second, nutritional. Grapes would add vitamins, natural sugars, and antioxidants to diets often lacking variety. Dried into raisins, they could be stored for lean months. Third, economic. If even a portion of those vines yielded wine, Burkina Faso could stake its place in a global industry worth more than $40 billion annually. For a country dependent on gold and cotton, a foothold in wine markets could be transformative. Still, skepticism abounded. International observers mocked the plan as fantasy viticulture. Wine in the Sahel? They scoffed. Foreign donors, excluded from leadership of the project, predicted certain failure. Even some villagers planted seedlings with little faith they would last a season. Yet Traoré pressed forward, insisting that the gamble itself mattered. If we fail as dreamers. he told his advisors. But if we do nothing, we fail as slaves to inevitability. The early days were backbreaking. Sandstorms buried trenches overnight. Goats chewed tender shoots. Irrigation kits cracked in the heat. Children carried water pots to each vine, their feet sinking into hot dust. But these very struggles became part of the story. State radio reminded listeners that vineyards in Europe had taken centuries to perfect. For Burkina Faso, the effort was about more than yields. It was about defiance. Each vine that survived the sun was not only a plant, but a soldier in a new kind of army. Roots against sand, leaves against wind, hope against despair. The campaign was unlike anything in the nation's history. It was not a development program, it was mobilization. Schools devoted lessons to viticulture, teaching children how to graft cuttings. Universities turned their laboratories into nurseries, racing to produce seedlings by the millions. Women's cooperatives tended vines in communal plots, singing songs about vines of freedom. Artists painted murals of green rose stretching across golden sands. For the first time in living memory, Burkinabe were not portrayed as victims of desertification, but as pioneers daring to resist it. This was the beginning of something larger than agriculture. It was the planting of identity, of sovereignty in living form. Even before the first grapes ripened, the narrative had shifted. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for rescue. It was rising to its own defense, armed not with foreign aid, but with roots, water, and imagination. But the desert, patient and merciless, had not yet spoken its final word. The first months were filled with doubt. Farmers planted vines but shook their heads, whispering that nothing so delicate could endure the Sahel's unforgiving sun. Ministers fretted over the cost. Foreign observers dismissed the effort as a distraction from serious agricultural policy. The international press ran mocking headlines, "Wine at the edge of the Sahara," painting the vision as quixotic at best, reckless at worst. And yet the vines did not all die. Some shoots wilted, yes, buried by sand or chewed by goats. But others clung stubbornly to life, pushing green leaves into the dry air as if to taunt the skeptics. Children gathered around them in awe. Elders touched them as though they were witnessing a miracle. Then came the rainy season. Short, violent bursts of water lashed the parched land, filling trenches and soaking clay pots buried deep beside the vines. When the storms passed, something extraordinary remained. Tiny clusters of green berries, fragile but undeniable, dangled from trellises. Grapes, real grapes, in the Sahel. Word spread like wildfire. Villagers carried the first clusters into town as though they were trophies. Mothers let children taste the fruit, their eyes widening at the sweetness. Farmers lifted them high, proof that the gamble was not folly but vision. What mattered was not quantity. Many vines were still too young, yields were tiny, but the fact that fruit had ripened at all. Against all odds, the desert had surrendered its first harvest. Traore seized the moment. In Ouagadougou, he organized a national festival, the Festival of the First Harvest. Grapes were paraded through streets on woven trays, children sang songs about vines of hope, and musicians composed ballads of defiance against the desert. Farmers wore wreaths of vine leaves. The army marched not with rifles but with pruning shears, symbolizing a new kind of front line. State television broadcast every detail. Images of villagers tasting grapes for the first time in living memory flashed across Africa and beyond. The celebration culminated in a scene that would become iconic. In a hall lined with farmers, soldiers, women's cooperatives, and students, Traore stood before a camera holding a glass filled with deep red liquid. It was the first vintage of Vin du Sahel, rough and unpolished, but unmistakably wine. He lifted the glass and declared, "This is not just wine. This is sovereignty in a bottle." The crowd erupted in cheers. Across the continent, Africans saw not only a drink, but a declaration. Burkina Faso would define itself, not be defined by others. Reactions were swift and divided. Across Africa, leaders who had mocked the project began to reconsider. Mali launched a pilot vineyard near its own desert frontier. Senegal integrated grapevines into its Great Green Wall initiative. Morocco sent teams of agronomists to advise. In Ghana, technicians offered expertise in fermentation and bottling. The phrase Traore's vines became shorthand for daring to attempt the impossible. Foreign observers, meanwhile, scrambled to explain what they had seen. Some newspapers grudgingly admitted, what was once fantasy now shows promise. Environmentalists praised the ecological benefits: vines stabilizing soil, slowing wind erosion, shading microclimates for other crops. Development agencies, which had dismissed the project, tried to rebrand it as part of climate resilience frameworks. Traore, however, refused to let outsiders claim credit. Every root belongs to the people, he declared. Every bottle belongs to the nation. But the greatest impact was psychological. For decades, Burkina Faso had been told their land was barren, their destiny limited. Aid, migration, or surrender had seemed the only paths. Now, as families drank juice pressed from their own grapes, they tasted not only sweetness but dignity. A farmer in Bobo Dioulasso summed it up simply, "Before we feared the desert, now the desert fears us." That statement spread across social media, repeated as a rallying cry. The transformation was cultural as much as agricultural. Grapes entered folklore. Poets wrote of vines that drink the sun. Painters filled city walls with murals of vineyards wrapping around dunes like green chains of defiance. Even cuisine shifted. Grape jam at weddings, juice at festivals, vine leaves wrapped around meat. What began as seedlings had become symbols woven into daily life. International buyers began circling. Diaspora communities in Paris and New York clamored for raisins and juice, eager to support the homeland. Traders from Asia and the Middle East expressed cautious interest. But Traore refused foreign monopolies. Cooperatives were established to keep profits in local hands. "We sell grapes," he told the nation, "not sovereignty." The gamble had reached its climax. What began in doubt was now undeniable. Burkina Faso had not yet become a wine superpower, but it had something more valuable. Proof that impossibility could be bent into possibility, that despair could ripen into pride. The first harvest did not flood markets, but it flooded hearts. In the villages of the Sahel frontier, children carried baskets of grapes with pride, women dried raisins in the sun, and elders tasted a sweetness they never imagined their land could yield. The arrival of the grapevine into Burkina Faso life marked a turning point not only for agriculture, but for society itself. Ecological transformation was the first and most visible consequence. Satellite images soon revealed a mosaic of green stretching across the desert belt, where once there had been only sand. Vines stabilized fragile soils. Their roots dug deep, locking earth against erosion. Their shade cooled the ground, allowing onions, tomatoes, and herbs to grow in the shelter of trellises. Beekeepers reported record honey harvests thanks to grape blossoms attracting pollinators. Even herders noticed grass sprouting near vineyards where none had grown in years. The desert was not defeated, but for the first time, it was forced to retreat. Economically, the effects rippled outward. Though small at first, cooperatives began to generate income. Women's groups sold raisins in regional markets. Young men pressed juice branded as Vin du Sahel, distributing bottles with maps of Burkina Faso proudly stamped on the labels. Diaspora communities in Europe and America paid premium prices for these early products, not for taste alone, but for pride. By the second harvest, a shipment of raisins had reached Dubai, while juice was sold in Paris shops catering to African migrants. For the first time, the country was exporting not just raw cotton or unrefined gold, but a cultural product with identity and story. Jobs multiplied. Students trained as agronomists found employment in vineyards rather than migrating abroad. Youth brigades transitioned from digging trenches to managing irrigation systems, bottling juice, and experimenting with fermentation. Professions once unthinkable in Burkina Faso, viticulturists, vintners, sommeliers, were suddenly part of the national vocabulary. Even tourism prospects began to stir with talk of vineyard trails and wine of the Sahel tours. But perhaps the greatest harvest was psychological. For decades, Burkina Faso identity had been shaped by survival, by drought, by dependency on aid. Now farmers began to call themselves keepers of vineyards. Children grew up not with stories of fleeing sandstorms, but of planting vines of freedom. In cities, murals proclaimed, "We are not beggars of grain, we are growers of prosperity." The project had seeded a cultural renaissance. Politically, the impact was profound. Traore had always framed the initiative as more than agriculture. "Every root is a border. Every vine is a flag," he declared. The vineyard belt became a living metaphor for sovereignty. Each hectare planted was not just soil defended, but independence asserted. When foreign corporations attempted to secure exclusive export rights, the government refused. "We sell grapes, not sovereignty," Traore told Parliament. That phrase echoed through marketplaces and sermons, reinforcing the conviction that the nation's wealth must remain in its own hands. This emphasis on sovereignty resonated deeply in a country long exploited for its gold and cotton by outsiders. By building an industry literally rooted in the soil, controlled by local cooperatives rather than foreign investors, Burkina Faso was making a declaration. Its future would not be dictated from abroad. This was Burkina Faso economic revival not by loans or donors, but by self-determination. Yet the consequences were not only economic or symbolic, they were also political. Within Africa, the Vineyard Initiative elevated Burkina Faso from a small, embattled state to a continental pioneer. Leaders from Mali and Niger toured the vineyards, considering their own adaptations. Senegal wove grapevines into its Great Green Wall project. The African Union began to speak of viticulture as part of climate resilience. Burkina Faso, once seen as a victim of geography, was now shaping regional policy. At home, the initiative consolidated Traoré's leadership. By involving farmers, students, women, and the army, he turned the Vineyard Project into a national cause that transcended politics. Opposition voices, wary of criticizing a program that had captured public imagination, struggled to find ground. Even those who had doubted him privately admitted that he had transformed despair into momentum. Still, challenges remained. Irrigation systems required constant maintenance. Yields were uncertain, weather unpredictable, markets volatile. Critics warned of overexposure, that a nation should not pin too much on grapes. Yet each setback was reframed not as failure, but as resilience training. No vineyard is built in a season, state radio reminded listeners. France's wine took centuries. Ours has just begun. The deeper truth was that the vineyard belt had already achieved something no statistic could measure. It had shifted identity. Burkina Faso was no longer merely a place where the desert advanced and aid agencies arrived. It was a nation daring to write its own future in vines. And so, as the second and third harvests ripened, the question was no longer whether grapes could grow in the Sahel. That had been proven. The question now was whether this fragile success could be expanded, defended, and transformed into lasting prosperity. The sight of grapevines shimmering under the Sahel's sun did not stay confined to Burkina Faso's borders. It ricocheted across Africa and beyond, forcing the world to take notice. For a continent often portrayed through famine and dependency, the image of villagers harvesting grapes in the desert was electrifying. African reactions came first. Mali announced experimental vineyards along its desert edge. Senegal integrated grape cultivation into its Great Green Wall program, hoping to turn barren belts into productive land. Niger, facing similar challenges, expressed interest in adapting the model. Morocco, with a longer tradition of viticulture, dispatched agronomists to offer technical guidance. Tunisia shared expertise in fermentation. Ghana pledged to support processing and distribution, seeing opportunities in a regional wine market. Across Africa, leaders debated. Could vineyards become more than agriculture? Could they become a symbol of resilience across the continent? The international media was divided. Some mocked the endeavor as fantasy viticulture, a quixotic gamble doomed by heat and drought. Others, struck by images of green shoots against yellow sands, shifted their tone. Articles appeared with headlines like "Wine at the Edge of the Sahara" and "The Sahel's Unlikely Vineyards." Environmentalists applauded the ecological potential, vines stabilizing soils, creating shade, and fostering biodiversity. Economists speculated about Africa tapping into a global wine industry worth over $40 billion. Suddenly, a nation long invisible on global economic maps was being discussed in the same breath as Bordeaux and Tuscany. The aid industry, however, found itself embarrassed. For years, international donors had poured money into irrigation projects and seed programs that failed to halt desertification. Now a young captain had mobilized his people without their permission or their funds. Agencies scrambled to rebrand the vineyards as part of climate resilience frameworks, but Traoré refused to cede narrative control. "No foreign corporation will own these vines," he declared. They belonged to the people, not to outsiders. The United States observed with mixed feelings. Washington had long considered the Sahel through the lens of counterterrorism and security, funding military bases and training missions. Yet here was Burkina Faso, asserting sovereignty not through weapons but through vineyards. American analysts debated, was this bold agricultural nationalism a threat to Western influence or an opportunity for partnership? Official statements were cautious, praising local resilience initiatives without mentioning wine directly. Behind closed doors, policymakers worried that if Burkina Faso succeeded on its own terms, other African nations might follow suit, reducing Western leverage. Meanwhile, in Europe, reactions were tinged with unease. French corporations eyed the vineyards as potential assets, only to be rebuffed. "We will export wine," Traore said, "but not our sovereignty." This refusal was as political as it was economic, a reminder that Burkina Faso's independence would not be bartered away. And so, while vines took root in Sahelian soil, they also took root in global consciousness. The project was no longer just about grapes. It was about narrative power. Africa, long cast as a victim of desertification, was reframing itself as a pioneer of resilience. The vineyards had proven their resilience through more than one harvest. Grapes now filled baskets in markets, raisins traveled to neighboring states, and bottles of vin du Sahel were poured with pride. Yet even as Burkina Faso celebrated, a larger question loomed. What path lay ahead for this bold experiment, and what choices did it open for Africa as a whole? The future was never guaranteed. Risks remained immense. Irrigation systems required constant maintenance. One broken line in the desert sun could doom hundreds of vines. Climate patterns were unpredictable. Rains too heavy in one season, too sparse in another. Global markets were fickle. Today's fascination with wine from the Sahel could become tomorrow's indifference. And behind every vineyard stood families still vulnerable to poverty, drought, and conflict. Yet alongside risks stood opportunities of historic scale. If Burkina Faso expanded its vineyards, it could diversify its economy beyond gold and cotton, anchoring a new industry rooted in culture as much as commerce. Tourism, too, beckoned. Travelers curious to taste wine at the desert's edge, to walk through rows of vines shimmering under Sahel's sun. Cooperatives could develop side industries, jams, juices, vine leaf cuisine, creating jobs across villages. Even more significant was the project's continental potential. Traore proposed a pan-African vineyard corridor, stretching from Burkina Faso through Mali, Niger, and Senegal, linking with Ethiopia's highland vines. Such a belt would not only slow desertification, but also symbolize continental unity. If Europe united around coal and steel, he told African Union delegates, why should Africa not unite around food and resilience? His call resonated with leaders tired of dependency, eager for a narrative of self-determination. At the heart of this vision was the principle of self-reliance resilience Africa. Grapes were never just fruit. They were proof that Africans could confront harsh climates with courage and innovation. The project demonstrated that solutions did not always come from donors or imported technologies. They could come from within, born of the soil, the people, and their imagination. For elders who had watched aid convoys arrive for decades, this shift felt almost spiritual, sovereignty sprouting from the ground itself. The road ahead demanded perseverance. To scale up vineyards, Burkina Faso would need investment in research, water management, and transport. It would need markets not only in Paris or Dubai, but across Africa itself, so that Burkinabe wine could be toasted at weddings in Lagos or Addis Ababa. It would require political will to keep foreign corporations at bay and ensure that farmers, not outsiders, reaped the benefits. Still, one truth was already undeniable. The desert had been challenged, and a nation had found its pride. Whether or not Burkina Faso became a wine power, it had planted something more enduring, the idea that Africa could choose its destiny. The vines were green, the grapes ripening, and the continent was watching. From the day Captain Ibrahim Traoré called his people to plant 5 million vines, many doubted. How could grapes, symbols of European estates and Mediterranean festivals, ever take root in Sahel dust? Yet season after season, the vines endured. They slowed the march of the desert, offered fruit to children, and filled bottles proudly labeled Vin du Sahel, product of Burkina Faso. The harvest was never only about grapes. It was about dignity. Each vine that survived declared that Burkinabe identity would not be erased by sand or by dependency. Each bottle raised in celebration testified to a nation's refusal to be defined by scarcity. What began as an agricultural gamble became a social awakening, a political declaration, and a cultural renaissance. Today, the world can no longer look at Burkina Faso and see only poverty or drought. It must see resilience, imagination, and the courage to turn impossibility into possibility. This is Burkina Faso economic revival, not built on foreign aid, but on the roots of sovereignty. It is a message to Africa and to the world. The desert is not death. It is only waiting for courage. For Africans across the continent, the lesson is larger than grapes. It is the principle of self-reliance, resilience, Africa, that no matter how harsh the climate, no matter how heavy the legacy of exploitation, a people who dare can reshape their destiny. The vines at the desert's edge are not only Burkina Faso's story. They are Africa's story, waiting to be written in every village, every field, every heart that refuses to surrender. And so, as the Sahel sun sets over rows of vines shimmering green against the sands, the future feels nearer. The desert may advance, but the people now advance too, with roots in the soil and hope in their hands. Burkina Faso has harvested more than fruit. It has harvested sovereignty. It has bottled not only wine, but a vision of tomorrow. If this story moves something in your chest, do not just scroll. Like, share, and subscribe. Our ancestors prayed for dignity, and now it is our turn to speak the future out loud. Comment below with your voice. New Africa, Africa rise. It's time for Africa. Because every word we raise together is another vine planted against the desert of despair.